Have you ever wondered why your cost for groceries may have increased by an incremental percentage, why things you would normally buy at a relatively more economical price seem to have skyrocketed? Well, that is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to inflation. Very simply, inflation occurs when prices rise, which in turn decreases the purchasing power of consumers' dollars. For example, in 1980, a movie ticket cost on average $2.89. By 2019, the average price of a movie ticket had risen to $9.16. Inflation is bad because it increases one's cost of living. If the inflation rate is exorbitant, it hurts the economy in an insidious manner. For starters, let's talk more about what inflation is, then move on to causes of inflation, transition to ways policy can prevent high inflation, discuss the impacts of inflation on GDP, and finally conclude by offering a perspective on who in the market benefits from unanticipated inflation. As I said before, inflation is essentially a decline of purchasing power. But before we even get there, what is purchasing power? Well, purchasing power is the amount of goods or services that one can purchase with a unit of currency. Basically, one's financial ability to buy products and services. So, a decline in purchasing power indicates that one is not necessarily able to engage in leisurely activities as they might otherwise. Disposable income is income remaining after various deductions, including taxes, available to be spent or saved at one's discretion. So, intuitively, as prices mount due to inflation, one's disposable income is reduced as habitual expenses, including commodities, take up a growing proportion of one's income. Ultimately, inflation results in numerous people having to make hard choices in terms of what to purchase and what not to purchase. Now, generally, if you've heard of inflation, you may have thought that printing money is a major reason. And while that is a cause, there is certainly more to it than just that. Usually, inflation stems from an increase in production costs or an increase in demand for products and services. In either case, that would cause prices to skyrocket. But what if I told you that increasing the circulation of money can be useful in quite a few situations? Before we get there, I'll talk about deflation. Deflation, as could be inferred from its name, is essentially the lowering of prices. Now, at first, one might be thrilled at the prospect of lowered prices, but not only is deflation bad, it is widely thought to be worse than inflation. Deflation results in fewer business profits, lower employment rates, employee wage cuts, and investment losses. Economists fear deflation because falling prices lead to lesser consumer spending, which is a major component of economic growth. So, layoffs and salary reductions are a result of deflation's insidious effects on the economy. But oftentimes, if there is deflation, the government will indeed circulate more currency in the economy. And that notion of preventing deflation leads me to my next point on how policies can reduce inflation. Governments can employ a variety of fiscal policies and techniques, such as wage and price controls, to combat inflation. However, the trade off is that such controls can cause recession and job losses. There's an important policy known as contractionary monetary policy, which central banks oftentimes employ to fight inflation. They do so by reducing the money supply within an economy through a variety of methods, including decreasing bond prices and increasing interest rates. The ultimate goal is to reduce inflation by contracting the amount of active money circulating in the economy. You may be familiar with GDP. Gross domestic product is the total market value of all finished goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific time period. When inflation is increasing, people will tend to spend more money because they know that it will be worth less in the future. This causes further increases in GDP in the short term, which is obviously an inaccurate representation of the market value of goods and services. This is where the concept of nominal and real GDP come into play. Nominal gross domestic product is GDP given in current prices, without adjustment for inflation. Oftentimes, nominal GDP isn't an accurate representation based on the reasons I just said. Not having accounted for inflation, nominal GDP tends to be higher than the actual or real GDP. Real GDP is a macroeconomic statistic that quantifies the value of goods and services produced by an economy in a specific time period, adjusted for inflation. Having been adjusted for inflation, real GDP is a more accurate measure. Now you might be wondering, how can I calculate real GDP? In general, calculating real GDP is done by dividing nominal GDP by the GDP deflator. But what's a GDP deflator? The GDP deflator is a measure of price inflation. It is calculated by dividing nominal GDP by real GDP and then multiplying by 100. So, with those formulas in mind, you can now calculate the real GDP of any economy and see where they truly stand. You may have heard of the concept of lending and borrowing money. Inflation can benefit both borrowers and lenders depending on the situation. Typically, when lenders lend money to borrowers, the interest rate accounts for inflation. However, if the inflation rate turns out to be higher than expected, then borrowers are able to pay lenders back with money worth less than when it was originally borrowed, which benefits borrowers. On the other hand, if the inflation rate turns out to be lower than expected, borrowers have to pay at a higher interest rate to the lenders, which benefits lenders. It's interesting to note the various market relations and observe how inflation impacts each of the market players. The topic of inflation is so vast and there is much more to learn. Hopefully, you've been motivated to learn more about this fascinating field of economics, where you can work towards solving real world problems. Alright, so now if you want to test your knowledge on this topic of inflation, then keep watching for the 5 questions I'll show after this. The answers to the questions will be in the description. Thanks for listening.